Good day to everyone. I'm Gabino James from VSC 2Y2-1. Today we're going to discuss the procedures in black and white printmaking. So we have contact printing and photo enlarger. So first, let's discuss the contact print. So let's go. So contact print is the same size as the negative. A contact sheet of all negatives on a roll makes it easy for you to examine and compare different frames. So you can choose ones to enlarge. Then you can file the contact with the negatives for later reference. And then the following method uses an enlarger as the light source and a contact printing frame to hold the negatives and printing papers. So our step one is position the enlarger. Close the slot where the negative carrier is inserted in the enlarger head. So that light will shine only on the baseboard and is not coming out of the slot. Um, this is particularly important in the school's group darkroom because stray light can fog other people's print, which on the enlarger lamp place the printing frame on the enlarger baseboard. Raise the enlarger head until the light covers the entire printing frame. Um, our next step is set the lens aperture and the enlarger timer. As a trial exposure, set the enlarger lens aperture to f11 and the timer to 3 seconds. Do a test strip using a 3-second invertals. So, the step 3 is identify the emulsion sides of the negatives and paper. The emulsion side of the negatives must face the emulsion side of the paper. Film tends to curl toward its emulsion side, which is duller than the back side. The emulsion side of the paper is shinier and glossy papers, smoother than the back side. And then the step 4, insert the negatives and one sheet of the paper in the printing frame. Um, the paper goes on the bottom, emulsion side up, the negatives go above the paper, and then the emulsion side down. The glass top of the frame sandwiches the negatives and the paper together tightly. If you don't have a printing frame, you can simply put the paper on the enlarger baseboard, the negatives on top of it, and a plain sheet of glass overall. And then the step 5, expose the print. With the printing frame in the place under the enlarger head, push the timer button to turn the enlarger light on and expose the print. Process the paper after fixing, evaluate the print. So this is the step 6, evaluate the print. Some of the frames will be lighter or other darker depending on the exposure each received in the camera. The judge print exposure overall, examine the film edges in the print. They should be black but with the edge number legible and with 35 mm film, a very slight difference between the edges and the darker sprocket holes. And this is the procedures in making a contact print. So now we're going to the photo enlarger. We have a part 1, setting up the enlarger. And this is the first step. Place your negative in the enlarger carrier. The enlarger carrier is the plastic tray that slide out of the enlarger. To put your negative in it, open up the tray and insert the negative into it so the image you want to enlarge is lined up with the square hole in the tray. Then close the tray and slide the carrier back into the larger. And then step 2, clamp the enlarger down over the carrier. Clamping down the enlarger will seal the negative inside of the enlarger carrier. The right way to clamp down the enlarger will depend on the photo enlarger you're using. But there's usually a switch or lever on the side of the device that you're supposed to pull or turn. And then step 3, position a sheet of scrap paper on the projection plane. The projection plane is the flat frame that hold the paper you'll be projecting onto. Lift up the top layer of the frame and insert a scrap piece of paper before closing it again. Then place the frame back down on the base of the enlarger. Step 4, turn off the lights in the darkroom. Turning the lights off will make it easier to see your image projected on the piece of scrap paper. It's also important that you turn the lights off since you'll be working with actual photo paper later on. If the light are on when you remove um, when you when you remove the photo paper from the packaging, it will be ruined. And then step 5, turn the enlarger on using the timer. The timer is the small box that's connected to the enlarger by a cord. To turn the enlarger on, locate the on switch on the timer and flip it. After you flip it, the display on the timer should light up. Then press the outlet focus to turn the light bulb inside the enlarger on. Step 6, um, adjust the height of the enlarger until the image fit on the scrap paper. There are us- there are there are should be a knob on the enlarger near the back or the side. That's allow you raise and lower it. When you raise the enlarger, the projected image will get bigger, and when you lower the enlarger, the image will get smaller. And step 7, focus the image using knob on the side of the enlarger. When you first enlarge a negative, it will likely be outside of focus. To fix that, turn the knob clockwise or counterclockwise until the image looks clear and crisp. Step 8, set the aperture on the enlarger to f8 or most photograph. The aperture setting determines how wide the lens opening on the enlarger is. The higher the aperture, the wider the lens and the more lights that pass through. The more light that passes through, the brighter your image will be. To adjust the aperture, rotate the lens on the enlarger until you get the f8. Um, Part 2, testing the exposure. Step 1, cut a strip of a photo paper to test the exposure with. Before you print onto a full-size sheet of paper, you'll need to test several exposure times on a strip of photo paper to see which time is best your image cut a strip that wide enough to capture a detailed portion of the image. The size of the strip image need to be precise. And part 2, step 2, place the strip of paper on the projection plane. Open up the top of frame and place the strip inside of it. Then close the frame. And step 3 in part 2, um, expose the entire strip of paper to light for 2 seconds. First, use the dial on the timer to set the exposure time to 2 seconds. Then press the start button on the timer to turn on the light bulb inside the enlarger. After 2 seconds, the light should turn off. And then step 4 in part 2, cover 1/5 of the strip and expose the rest of it for another 2 seconds. Use a piece of a thick scrap paper to cover up the end of strip. That way, that portion of the strip won't be exposed to any more light. And you'll be able to see what 2 seconds of light exposure looks like once you develop it. After you cover 1/5 of the strip, set the timer to 2 seconds and press the start button. Step 5 in part 2, repeat until you expose 5 seconds to different duration of light. For each additional section, increase the exposure time. Use the following schedule for the remaining 3 seconds. And then, step 6 in part 2, develop the test strip. Dip the strip of paper in the development bath for at least 60 seconds. Then transfer it to a stop bath for 30 seconds, stirring it continuously. Next, submerge the paper in a fixed bath for 30 seconds. Finally, rinse it with water for 1 to 2 minutes. Step 7 in part 2, use the test strip to determine the best exposure time for your final print. Um, your developed image should be divided into 5 distinct sections, and then choose the section that you looks the best, and write down the exposure time for that section so you can see it for your final print, the exposure times for the different section. And then step 8 in part 2, make a more specific test strip if none of the exposures look quite right. The test strip is a good way to narrow down what exposure time might be the best for your image. And then we have a part 3, enlarging and developing your final print. Step 1 in part 3, turn the lights off again. Do this before you remove the photo paper for your final print so it's not ruined by the light. If it's not still on, turn the red safety light on so you can see what you're doing. Step 2 in part 3, place a full sheet of photo paper on the projection plane. Lift up the top of the frame, insert the paper and close the frame, then place the projection plane on the base of the enlarger. Step 3 in part 3, expose the paper to light using your desired exposure time. Set the exposure time on the timer using the dial. Then make sure the projected image is lined up with the photo paper and press the start button on the timer. Step 4 for part 3, develop your final print. Repeat the developing process that you use for the test strip. Start with the development bath for 60 seconds, then dip the paper in the stop bath for 30 seconds. Finally, transfer the paper to the fixed bath for 30 seconds before rinsing it up with water. And then when you're finished developing your final print, hang it up to dry in the dark room. And this is the how to develop a photo enlarger. So thank you very much.